Habemus Papam. We have a Pope, a member of the Jesuits with a bit of a Franciscan spirit as well. Stay tuned to find out more. Welcome to an EWTN Theology Roundtable on the new Pontificate. I'm your host, Colin Donavan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN. And I'm joined on this roundtable by three religious you know well. Father Mitch Pacwa, a member of the Society of Jesus and host of EWTN Live, and too numerous other programs on EWTN to begin naming. And of course, Father Anthony Mary Stelton, and who is Father Guardian of our Franciscan Missionaries of the Eternal Word, and Father Patrick, also the Franciscan Missionaries. Well, we do have a new Pope, and he's a Pope, a Jesuit, the first religious since the 1800s, and Pope Gregory XVI, who was a Camaldolese, a form of Benedictine religious. And so we've had a lot of firsts besides the first religious since those days. The first Pope to take the name Francis, and some discussion as to why he did that, and I think we now know the answer after St. Francis. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time, and I think people probably have a lot of questions about what does this mean for the Church and for the Pontificate going forward. We've already seen certain actions that the Holy Father has taken, clearly a life of simplicity, attention to poverty, and lack of, you might say, too much formalism and so on. This seems to be part of his character. I think Father Mitch, you know, we look at the question of him first being as a religious. The religious take vows of obedience, of chastity and poverty, and the Jesuits specifically take a fourth vow. What do you see so far about how Francis has, both as Cardinal Bergoglio, has lived that Jesuit avowed life, and how that is also starting to manifest itself in his papacy?
Yeah. Well, one point I'd like to make in terms of the choice of his name as Francis. In the very short autobiography of St. Ignatius Loyola, one of the lines he makes is this wish, an expression of, oh, I wish I could live like St. Francis. Because next to Our Lady, St. Francis of Assisi was St. Ignatius' favorite saint. And so I suspect, you know, my provincial and I talked about it the day of the election and the announcement, and you know, that was one of the things that my provincial brought up, and that this certainly would be an aspect of still being linked to St. Ignatius, who had this great devotion to St. Francis and an ideal of St. Francis in terms of living out the religious life. You know, in terms of the vows, I'll say we have 4 vows, and solemn vows, when we are you know, taking our final vows as Jesuits. And the normal ones, poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also a special vow of obedience to the Pope. Now, of course, his won't be strained.
He should be of one mind with the Pope, one would think, so it would not be too difficult.
Yes, you know, I think, are you going to listen to me today? You know, so he'll be all set with that. But that's, you know, certainly a key element. And in terms of his, in Jesuit life, the vow that is highlighted among the 3 is obedience, because it's seen especially in light of Christ always reflecting. For instance, in every chapter of John's Gospel, through chapter 1 through 17, it emphasizes that Jesus obeyed the Father for the mission of coming here to the earth. And a very important meditation in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius is the incarnation. And that sense of the Son's mission from the Father, highlights the role of obedience. So this has certainly been part of his own life. And he's, accepted the various missions he's been given in sometimes difficult circumstances, including the mission given by the Pope, because one of our other vows that we, besides the 4 solemn vows, we have some simple vows that we take, back in the sacristy after we take our final vows. And among those vows are that we will do nothing to try to become a superior. If you're caught trying to become a superior, you can be dismissed automatically. Also, we will do nothing to try to become a bishop. Now, the Pope can order us to break, because it's a simple vow. And in obedience, Cardinal Bergoglio, accepted that mission to become the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires.
I think
but it's not something that we sought.
One of the questions, of course, people have is he now under the, say when he was made the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, would he have been under the Jesuit superior? And canon law gives us the answer to that, that a bishop is released from that obligation. He remains a member of his order, but he is released now from the obligation of obedience to all but the Holy Father. And of course, the congregation of bishops and others who exercise the Holy Father's authority over the church. So,
it's because the College of Bishops has that direct union with Peter. And, in the past history of the church, we certainly saw situations where various noble families would, try to get, Episcopal sees for their second or third oldest sons. Oldest son would get the family lands, and then the next sons would get to be an abbot or a bishop or something, because they wanted control of that by the family. Whereas, the Pope doesn't choose religious from different orders to give them control for their order over various dioceses. That's just out of the question. It's to be at the service of the church.
Yeah, and that brings up a question of poverty, of course, which we'll get back. Obviously, there is a particular Jesuit way of looking at that. But I think something that strikes people with regard to poverty is, again, the Franciscan connection. We think of Francis with his, even to the point of stripping off his clothes when to demonstrate that everything was for God. This is certainly a Franciscan element, not that it's not also a Jesuit element, but has anything particularly touched you in that regard, Father?
Well, I think the focus of St. Francis in placing such an emphasis on poverty is looking at Christ, who came among us and lived as someone who was poor. And he'd often make that reference to Christ and his Holy Mother. And he wanted to imitate their poverty and have that sense of detachment from this world, so that there was a focus on the other world. And if I can live without here, it can be put to the service of those who are in need, of the poor. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in Pope Francis's life, an example as a cardinal in living a life of great simplicity and an identification with the poor. And I think we see that even in his spirituality, a very, if I could use the word, earthy, tangible experience of Jesus in his own life, in his spirituality.
I think that's clear in his case that, it's in many respects we here, unless we have an apostolate to the poor, we can identify with the poor by helping various charities who serve the poor. As the Archbishop, he would go among them, and of course he would send the priests into the barrios or into the slums and that in order to evangelize people who maybe no longer had much thought for the church because their life was so difficult. So he had that immediate contact as Francis did. Mm-hmm. And as I was telling Father Mitch before the program, the Jesuits that I've known personally in any depth clearly have also had a great sense of poverty in the way that they lived without any kind of aggrandizing or accumulation of goods and that. And how is poverty generally expressed and understood then within the society?
Once again, it goes back to the spiritual exercises. In the first principle and foundation that St. Ignatius gives at the beginning of the exercises, he brings out how all creatures are made by God. All of them are good. And therefore, it is logical for us to want to use creatures insofar as it gives greater glory to God, and you refrain from using them insofar as they don't give greater glory to God, and that's also the motto of society, to do things for the greater glory of God, ad maiorem Dei gloriam. And St. Ignatius places in there, therefore, I will want neither a long life nor a short life, riches nor poverty, nor sickness nor health. Whatever God gives me, I want to use for his greater glory. And in those areas where I have freedom to seek things out, I will seek out that which is going to give greater glory to God. So, and that is especially in line with St. Ignatius' meditation on Christ the King. He also emphasizes how Christ came here to earth in very simple livery. He says, imagine an earthly king. And Ignatius was certainly thinking of Emperor Charles V, who was the emperor, his emperor at the time. And all the great caparisoned horses and all that, big flags and wealthy clothes and armor and all. And then contrast Christ, who comes with simple raiment. And again, as St. Francis of Assisi, St. Ignatius had that same sense, that Christ came among us poor. So we can use that poverty as one of the gifts of creation for God's greater praise and glory.
I think it's useful to see, again, when a religious becomes a bishop, what canon law says on this. We already mentioned that the obedience of a bishop who is also a religious is to the Pope and not to a religious superior of his community. Poverty, he doesn't lose the vow or promise, whatever the character is in the particular community of poverty, but he now uses the material things that he needs to as a bishop and as administration of them as he needs to serve the diocese, as opposed, in the case of the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, the society. As you mentioned earlier, it's not accumulated for the society now, but it's accumulated for the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires, and now as Pope, it's accumulated for the Holy See, and it's administered the patrimony of the Holy See on behalf of the Holy See and no other entity or organization in the church. So I thought that's an interesting perspective, or an interesting explanation of canon law.
That the individual congregation allows that member to fulfill his office. Now, this is what the church has asked of him, and so he's free to do what he needs to do without the common exercise in community life, you might say.
Yeah, as Father Mitch mentioned earlier, not to have the vainglory of seeking offices and privileges, but when the church, the Holy Father, comes and says, will you do this for the church, also should have then the humility to accept that and to take that
A good example would be Cardinal Martini, who was the Cardinal of Milan. And when it came time for him to retire, because cardinals are expected, and bishops are expected to offer their resignation at age 75, he did so. he stepped down, and then he just went to live back in one of the Jesuit communities for our school in Jerusalem, and he just was part of the community like everybody else. So that he wouldn't say, "Oh, I got to get something out of this for my retirement." No, it just goes back to the community.
Yeah, in fact, canon law establishes that normally the community would provide, for instance, for a retired bishop or cardinal, as the case may be, or the diocese which he served, in this case the Holy See, could do it. So either of those provisions, but it would be to continue on the practice of that poverty that was a principle of one's whole life after one had taken one's vows. And of course, chastity, Father Patrick, is one that's much easier to understand. Bishop must be chaste, religious must be chaste, and even the secular clergy, even though they don't, in the Latin rite, they don't take a vow of chastity, they make a promise of celibacy. So that won't really effectively change at all.
No, it will not. And with the whole vows again for religious, we make these vows in order to imitate Christ ultimately. And just to, I was thinking of the witness of a religious now being the Pope, and that he has professed these vows, and that in a sense all of us are called to live the evangelical counsels. Not all of us profess them, but to live them in imitation of Christ according to our state in life. To have a spirit of detachment, again, as Father Mitch was saying, to use things. We profess to be poor in fact and in spirit. But all of us, we should be using possessions for the glory of God, not to be attached. Ultimately, it's that we might cling to God, to be obedient to the church, to God, to keep the commandments, and to be chaste according to our state in life. But yeah, like you said, this is something that's not going to change. And it does free us to give ourselves more completely to God and to the church and the service of the church.
I think St. Thomas would situate that within the aspect of zeal, that the person who through a zeal embraces the vows undertakes something that is very, very difficult and is both more meritorious for fulfilling thereby and more demeritorious for not fulfilling and failing to fulfill. So there is that element of that total generosity, that being a completer freedom, but also completer responsibility and obligation. Because indeed, the diocesan priest promises obedience to the bishop and his successors, promises celibacy, and the Code of Canon Law says of the diocesan that they should have evangelical simplicity. So there's not a vow, but there is a call to live a sort of evangelical spirit, a gospel-based spirit of detachment. And then the laity as well, of course, are called to have that same kind of simplicity and be for God according to their state in life. Well, when we come back, we'll look a little, just briefly, at the vows and at some of the aspects of theology and of the election itself in particular that the election of Pope Francis brings to mind. Be back in a moment.
Salve radic, salve porta, ex mundo lux. Salve radic, salve porta, ex mundo lux est orta. Cade Virgo gloriosa.
Well, welcome back. We're going to close out the section on dealing with the vows by I'm going to read a little section here from the actual vow that a Jesuit makes at the time of profession. It is something that is made to his superior. So, for example, any of the superiors who then represent the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, quote, and his successors, and holding the place of God, promising perpetual poverty, chastity, and obedience, and in conformity with it, special care for the instruction of children according to the manner of living contained in the apostolic letters of the Society of Jesus and its constitutions. Further promising, quote, a special obedience to the sovereign pontiff in regard to the missions according to the same apostolic letters and constitutions, unquote. I was struck, poverty, chastity, obedience, we already know that. about special care for the instruction of children, and then obviously the fourth vow also with regard to obedience to the pontiff in regard to the missions as being a special character of the Jesuits.
St. Ignatius started that with two of the early Jesuits, the first members of the society, who were asked by Pope Paul III to be his personal theologians at the Council of Trent. And Ignatius instructed them that when you are not directly involved in council business, you are to go to the children that live on the street and instruct them in the faith and catechism. And this was something we thought in some ways as a historical situation, but I recall when I was working on my dissertation in Nashville, Tennessee, you're thinking all these thoughts and stuff, but I would celebrate Mass every morning for the local Catholic grammar school, Christ the King Grammar School. And then after Mass, I would go and teach the first and second grade for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And that was one of the most healthy things I could do in graduate school. Because you have to explain, these, like when you say, Lord have mercy, or glory to God in the highest, what does mercy even mean to a first and second grader? And as you have children, you have to explain every word. And doing that gets you back down to where the faith really is key. And that's what Ignatius wanted those first fathers to do. And this is something that's part of our history. And certainly, I didn't like teaching high school when I was assigned to do so at first, but that was where I learned how to be a teacher. So I appreciate those students very, very much. So that's one element of the vows. Another is that we have this obedience to the Supreme Pontiff, the Pope, and that any mission that he gives to us, we are to take it. And we may not question, that's in our Constitution. If he gives it, we may not question it, and we may not do anything to try to influence the Pope to give us a particular mission. We just take what he gives us. It's very interesting to me that on the Sunday after Pope Francis' election, Father General, Father Adolfo Nicolas, he's from Spain originally, but he's been a missionary in the Far Orient, Japan and other parts of the Orient. He came and met with the Pope at Casa Santa Marta, and said to him, they embraced, and showing the filial relationship that we have with the Pope, though he's one of our Jesuit brothers. We don't take that for granted, and the Father General wrote to us very clearly, there is no room for triumphalism in this. This is about God's choice. And the sense of the Father General saying to Pope Francis, I lay the whole society at your disposal, so that Father General is also as subject to the Pope as any of the rest of us with final vows.
And the popes have over the centuries given the Jesuits particular missions. To promote devotion to the Sacred Heart is one of the central missions that the Jesuits do under in various fashions. I think to touch on one final point regarding the poverty of Pope Francis, the simplicity of his approach, some question, is this not too much? Should not a pope sort of manifest his episcopal dignity, his papal dignity, with the all the proper embellishments of that office and so on and so forth? And there are good reasons for doing so. I mean, the Pope is representing the entire Church. We wouldn't want the President of the United States to appear in certainly in rags. So there are reasons for that, and I found this quote in St. Thomas. I remembered studying it at one point. And he's answering a question with regard to when someone is placed in a position of dignity, what should govern that? And he's answering an objection that's basically saying that, well, you continue to live in poverty. He says, those who are placed in a position of dignity, or again, the ministers of the altar, are attired in more costly apparel than others, not for the sake of their own glory, but to indicate the excellence of their office or of the divine worship. And this is the point I think most people understand, and they have no difficulty with it.
Why we wear vestments.
Why you wear vestments, why gold chalice is
right.
used for the precious blood, and so on.
And that we never would use the sacred vessels, take them back home for a hamburger and a milkshake. I mean,
right, this
that would
kind
be
of
sacrilege.
Yeah.
It's for the divine liturgy.
Right, and so people don't have any difficulty with, going to the extreme of giving as to God, which we ought to do. Mm-hmm. He says, therefore, it is not sinful in them. It would be sinful in others. It would be ostentatious to do something to do that. And then he quotes Augustine, whoever uses outward things in such a way as to exceed the bounds observed by the good people among whom he dwells, either signifies something by so doing or is guilty of sin, inasmuch as he uses those things for sensual pleasure or ostentatious. So there's sort of two streams here where the mean is. On the one hand, God is deserving of everything. On the other hand, there is a point at which, in a certain context, it would be ostentatious in show, for instance, to have a grandiose display. And so I think the mean is in there to give what is worthy to God, and there's no question that the vestments, the attitude, the piety of the Pope shows worthy to God. But I think, again, in his whole persona and his whole experience is to be with the poor. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, to be with the poor. And so he is sort of bringing everything back, I think, to, yes, dignity on the one hand, but simplicity on the other, having regard for the situation in the world where a fifth of the human race lives in very austere circumstances, and where he himself in his whole life has lived a greater simplicity for that reason. So I think the criticisms are misplaced to see this as saying, well, the dignity of God means nothing if we're not wearing, the most elaborate vestments or the most brocaded chasuble or something like this. There is dignity also in the simplicity of what he is using, as well as in his regard for Christ in the poor. And I think that would be a mean that St. Thomas would very much approve of.
And I think too, Colin, the man chosen to be the Holy Father brings with him his own background and life experience and personality. And it's not so much a rejection of the papacy, but that colors that, or it kind of is brought into his own pontificate. Mm-hmm. And we see that even in Pope Benedict. He was a very studious man, but a very humble man in the way he came and stepped into the papacy. Pope John Paul II had his whole background and his experience with communism, but also his a love for the youth, his ability to, on the stage, you might say, he really put that at the service of the papacy in the way he brought Christ into the world. I think that's important to remember as Pope Francis begins, that he has a whole history that just doesn't suddenly get chopped off, but he's still this living person that has suddenly been asked to do this.
And I think a false comparison is made in that regard between, say, Benedict and somehow these are different. Temperamentally, personality-wise, yes, they are different, and that's reflected in their different approach to these kinds of questions.
Sure, very much so. And something that I being the oldest guy here, I remember.
Not by much.
but there's a significant way in which, remembering things. I was in 8th grade, or just graduated 8th grade, when Paul VI was elected. And you can see a change going on through the 20th century. Archbishop Sheen pointed out how Pope Benedict XV was crowned way under the chair at the very back of St. Peter's. Pius XII was at the main altar. Paul VI was outside the front door. And Paul VI also was the last one to have the triple tiara. And immediately after his election, it was fairly simple, but he sold it for the poor. And he also, when he was visiting, Manila, he took off his ring and gave that for the poor. And in fact, when he sold his tiara, an American bought it, gave it to the National Shrine, and there's a poor box still, so that it's still helping attract money for the poor. And that gradual process of, in a sense, divesting the papacy of some of the, more Renaissance and Baroque, accoutrement, the signs of, great manifestation of, actual political power. It was a political power to be Pope, and you had to deal with kings. And now we're moving away from that towards this apostolic ministry, as the last popes have especially emphasized.
And I think, although there are some in the church who lament the days of the papal states and that worldly power, I think the popes have recognized that in a sort of a backhanded way, Garibaldi and the Italian army did a favor to the church in taking away the political state, the papal states, because although in a way it was intended to an affront, I think, to the Pope and to the Church, at the same time, I think it has done a tremendous amount of benefit for the Church that highlights more and more that evangelization is why the Church exists on the earth, not to run the central part of Italy and to do those kinds of things.
When you think back, how many popes of the 17th or 18th century can you remember?
Not
Any
many.
stick in your mind? No. But as you say, as the loss of the papal states really took hold, we have a lot more sense of the role of Pius IX, Leo XIII, and the popes of the 20th century have been much, much more influential in the world than the 17th or 18th century popes.
Yeah. And it may not be coincidence that it was after the loss of the papal states that the Church's development, a clear process of theological development of social doctrine has taken place.
Exactly.
As there has been a deeper appreciation of the necessity of assisting the poor. Not that the Church never did that. Hospitals and all the other things that the Church has done, founding hospitals, most of the early hospitals in Europe, just as the early universities for educating people. So this has been in some way in God's providence the direction in which the Church is being led.
Yes.
And I think it's because the closer we get to the end of time, far off as it may be, the more the Church is called to be like Christ.
Yes.
And in the end, of course, it will suffer like Christ.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing taking place. Well, you mentioned discernment, Father. A little bit about the election. I was struck by a comment that Cardinal Dolan made in one of the interviews on EWTN. I believe it was with on the morning show that Colin did, yes. And that is how there was they went into the conclave each of them, of course, with their own sense of who the principal individuals were they thought that would be worthy or that the church needed at this time. But with the advancing votes, there was a sense of discernment that they felt, because the conclave is quiet except for liturgical prayer and the coming and going of the cardinals to go up and place their vote and make their oath that their vote is according, to the mind of God as they discern it. But they really had this sense of discernment, and that's a very Jesuit quality. It struck me that this is almost precisely what is described in terms of discernment of spirits in these spiritual exercises, which is an important guide for us. But we were going to have to break at this point, and when we come back, Father Mitch is going to tell us more about that connection. Well, we're back, and we want to talk a little bit about the election itself and the process by which the cardinals reached their decision. And by process, I don't mean to imply that this was purely a human exercise on the one hand, or that it was purely a supernatural thing on the other, some divine inspiration which overcame the cardinals and against their will forced them to elect Cardinal Bergoglio as the next pontiff. It really was a very reasoned process, and whether you're a Jesuit or a Thomist, Dominican, I think there's clearly the understanding that we are given reason, we use it, we make a good judgment, and if we are open to grace, that we are led to a discernment. And this is what I think Cardinal Dolan described, the way the cardinals in that situation, in that prayerful context, in that serious circumstance, were led collectively to discern, not with any evident outward sign of the Holy Spirit's action, but with the interior sense that grace was leading them that way. And this is very much described in the spiritual exercises which St. Ignatius wrote.
Exactly. St. Ignatius has two sets of rules for discernment. On one hand, when you're doing the first week of the exercises, the rules of discernment are applied to understand the various interior movements away from sin and toward virtue. And he lays out the way that operates. But then, as we go to the second week of the exercises, which is in its fullness a 4-week retreat, he also focuses on discernment of God's will in terms of one's choice of state of life. And that those rules for discernment apply to other choices. The first week deal with moral choices. Second week deals with, you have an array of goods. So for instance, the cardinals could look at all the College of Cardinals, say, we have a number of really great men here, but which one does the Lord want? So it's not a matter of choosing a bad person versus a good one, but a number of goods.
So it's not strictly a human calculation, but it's a calculation based on what you discern to be the will of God in this context.
Exactly. And and you're correct. St. Ignatius brings out that this is part of using human reason. So for instance, the time that the cardinals spent trying to understand what is the situation of the church and what do we need.
Right. And that took place in the general congregations before the conclave.
Exactly. But then in another kind of quiet, like you described, there'd be the celebration of the liturgy, and then in the election process, prayer, and then a quiet election process. It's not like a political convention where people are waving flags and we're going to say to this and, you know.
Bergoglio.
Yeah. and also, it was very interesting. I did a lot of channel surfing during the election process and then after the announcement. And the secular folks were talking, it would be good to get somebody because of what might seem to be politically correct ethnic choice or territorial choice or something, you know, or political. They saw this in terms of forces of politics. And the cardinals, exactly.
Going on, yeah.
And they use a model from the world. And that's precisely what St. Ignatius and the church in general would call us away from. That we're not trying to discern power plays for aggrandizement by various groups. You know, and you heard various folks in the secular media. Will this guy be in favor of gay marriage? You know, one thing, married priests and all this. They focused on politics and sexuality. That was their theme. The cardinals are trying to listen. What is God stirring us up in terms of understanding our needs, but listening to what God is asking for of us and of the individual who will be elected. And that's a totally different process of where are the good spirits moving us and where are the bad spirits moving us. You know, what leads to agitation, what leads to peace. And you can see that the discernment process was very effective. By the way, a strong sense of peace entered into the church and a joy in the crowd. The way that he bowed before everybody to ask for prayers before he gave his blessing. The response to that was, you know, joy. And so many of these other little things that he does keeps evoking that joy. And that's part of that good discernment that's going on. And not, well, we have an American and goofy stuff. Which is something, by the way, I might add, we don't see in the way they run the Congress or the administration.
That's true. If we had a little bit of discernment there, maybe we'd have a little bit of peace as well.
I mean, when the vice president says he wants to go for gay marriage because he watches a television comedy, you know, Will and Grace, that's not good discernment.
No, definitely not. But I think it is a beautiful example. Of course, as you noted, all of the church's theological traditions, this is certainly very strong in the Jesuit tradition, the 30-day exercises, all of that is geared to a discernment of what to do with one's life, how to, and certainly
how to serve Christ the King. That's the goal.
What do I do
to serve Christ
this
the King?
may be the unusual case where others got to discern what to do with your life, because now, in a way, Pope Francis is now captive of that decision and must live out that life, I think, quite happily. I think he is coming. You see, I think, days going on, you see there was a little nervousness there on the balcony. I think he gets more comfortable in his white cassock as time goes on, and finds more personal peace in that.
And I think, you know, part of that is that he maintained the name Jesus in the center of his papal coat of arms.
Right. That what is the crest also of the Jesuits.
Right. It's which, by the way, is derived from a Franciscan. It was Saint Bernardine of Siena who first made that sunburst with the first 3 Greek letters of the name of Jesus, the Iota, Eta, Sigma, which looks like that's IHS, but it's not. It's Iota, Eta, Sigma, and it's Jesus, you know, Jesus. And that's from Saint Bernardine of Siena. And the Jesuits have it there. And once again, a combination of Franciscan and Jesuit components.
Okay. We talked a little bit, Father Anthony, about his poverty, about the spirit of poverty that all religious are called to, indeed all Christians are called to in one measure or another. He sometimes directly with words, and certainly by example, he seems to be emphasizing a preferential option for the poor, which is not a forgotten social doctrine of the Church, but it seems to be one which has caused many arguments in the Church in recent decades. We can think of liberation theology, which used a Marxist analysis in order to take a class struggle as sort of the leitmotif of getting the poor out of poverty, as opposed to charity. But he has clearly, through his own example as a Jesuit, as an archbishop, really lived this preferential option for the poor as a primacy of charity towards the poor.
Right. And I think his emphasis is on recognizing the dignity of the individual. We're not fighting a battle, but to see each person as this child of God that we have an obligation to love and care for. Even in some of his comments, that when you go and serve the people of God, when you attend to the sheep, you're to return and you have the smell of the sheep on you because you've been among them. I think even in the early days of his pontificate, the way he's choosing to live is reflective of not only his background as a religious, but even as a priest. It's not so much, okay, I'm going to just reject everything that, this papal apartment, but a desire to pray with other priests, to be among other priests. And I think we see that it strengthens your own identity and reminds you of who you are when you live with other priests. When you live with the poor, work with the poor, you're more mindful of them and you don't lose sight of them. And he had that desire that it would be a church of the poor, a church for the poor, and a church that is poor.
Was sort of interesting in keeping with what Father Mitch was saying about how secular media portrayed the election and all of that. There's been something of an effort to appropriate him as the Pope of liberal economic values, when that not at all is what he is about. I think if anything, he has been an opponent of various government actions, for instance, in Argentina. For the preferential option for the poor, it's not what can the government do for you, but what can other human beings, especially other Christians who have this as an obligation, do for you, the poor. And I think this is a big distinction that many in the media are missing, that the church is not about class struggle, about the lack of dignity of the rich, that the rich are living, the 1% is living off the 99, as someone has put it in recent days. But it's about the dignity of all human beings, rich and poor, but the obligation, especially of the rich, to reach out in charity, person to person, and not necessarily through the state, but in a primacy of charity towards the individual.
That's right. And when it comes down to it, simply put, these are our brothers and sisters. And as St. Francis himself, we were talking about the Franciscan and Jesuit roots, especially, he would remind the friars that our Lord himself was poor. Again, we're imitating him and going out and being among the poor, helping them, and to show that, again, what we have is not for us to cling on to, but to give back to God and serving others.
And Colin, I notice with the secular media, what really captures their attention is when they see a witness of charity. They don't always realize what they're looking at, but they're, oh, just, did you see that? Did you see that? And it happens, it's happening with him. It would happen with Pope Benedict. It would happen with Pope John Paul. I think when they see any holy person do what a holy person is supposed to do in imitating Christ, the world doesn't behave that way. So all of a sudden you see this witness of Jesus, and it does fascinate and it attracts. And I think that's what love does, is it attracts you. They want to imitate that. They want to feature that because it's not what we're used to seeing.
And I think, given that there are clearly many injustices in the world economic order, and he is indicating the solution to those is a measure of personal asceticism, as it were, or poverty, according to one state in life, obviously, a family man needs more goods than a religious or a secular priest. So there is a proportion there. But also that this charity, that what you have you then share with others in need, and that this is the primary order of the day. Yes, the government is there to provide the social net that catches those who no one else can catch. But at the same time, that ought to be the last resort, because there are many evils that also come with the dependence upon government.
Two things in terms of that last comment. One part of the reality of Henry VIII's approach to dealing with the church and his so-called reform was to confiscate church property, to give it to his noble friends, whereas that church property had been the main means of caring for the poor. And then it later devolved on the state to invent things like the poorhouses and the workhouses that they did, whereas the church had done that with another level of care at all the monasteries. And so they undid what the church was doing, took it upon the state, who then, as Charles Dickens describes so well, they made a mess of it. And we'll need another Dickens to write the stories of what goes on in our own welfare state and how it destroys families. The second thing, too, is that Brother Tarcisius of your community, brought in a number of little episodes of how Pope Francis doesn't just have this global concern for the poor, but he also has a recognition of individual poor people. So, for instance, he telephoned the newspaper man that delivered his paper and said, I have to cancel my subscription because I've moved. And the guy started yelling and cussing at him. Said, were you playing some sort of joke? He said, no, this is really, Padre Jorge. He called him, and the guy was totally blanched. But it wasn't the Pope that told that story.
Yeah.
It was this guy. It was just that Pope Francis recognized delivering these papers is how this man makes his living. In terms of global politics, it's insignificant. But in terms of this individual poor person's life, it is significant. And he has that sense of those individuals.
Well, it seems obviously we could go on for the rest of the day here, and we could talk about his continuing emphasis in many of his talks already around being protectors of creation, of the environment, is certainly a theme which Benedict and John Paul II also took up. We could talk about his interest, of course, in peace, which he spoke at length in his Urbi et Orbi on Easter Sunday and the troubled areas of the world. When we could talk about his interest also in dialogue, a very Franciscan element, especially with respect to the Muslims. But we've run out of time, and so we thank you for joining us tonight, and I thank our members of our panel for being here with us. God bless.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces orta.